Okay, so what we're going to talk about in chapter 15 is economic regulation and antitrust policy. I've alluded to this really for the better part of the semester, that there was a set of regulations that market structures, firms in certain market structures were subject to really promote competition, hopefully for you and I, right? And so economic regulation and antitrust policy, this is the government's attempt to try and increase competition, decrease market power, increase social welfare, right? All of that kind of good stuff that comes from good, solid economic regulation. Now, I'm going to preface that by saying our government doesn't always do the best job at this, but we're going to talk about it in more general terms, and we're not really going to get into specifics, but this isn't about political parties here. This is about our government being very bureaucratic, right? We'll get to that. So let's talk about market power first, because really this economic regulation and antitrust policy addresses market power. By failing to expand output to the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost in the society, firms with market power produce less of a good than would be socially optimal. So socially optimal means lots of consumer surplus, perhaps some producer surplus, trying to get away from that deadweight loss. But market power is a condition in which firms fail to expand output to the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost. And we'll get to that. I'll show you a graph here in a minute, and we'll kind of talk about this. But basically, this regulation is designed to address market power and to make sure that market power doesn't get out of control in certain markets to the point where, you know, it erodes competition and isn't good for the public as a whole. So we break down government regulation into three basic categories. We're going to touch on two of those. The first one that we're not really going to talk about is social regulation. So there's lots of social regulation out there, but in terms of market structure and markets and resource markets and things like that, this would be, social regulation would be like health and safety in the workplace, things like that, right? We don't really talk about it in this class. You'll talk about it in management classes. You'll talk about it if you get into human resources. That's really for those classes. We're going to focus on these second two. We're going to focus on economic regulation and antitrust policy. Economic regulation, we're really talking about natural monopolies here. So economic regulation aims to control price, output, entry of new firms, and quality of service in industries where monopoly seems inevitable or desirable. Yeah, sometimes monopoly is inevitable or desirable. What we're really talking about is natural monopolies. And my examples of natural monopolies were really utility companies, in your local utility company, your gas company, electric, water, whatever. The example that we're going to use in this chapter is going to be a subway system. So public transportation can also be a natural monopoly. It depends on who's running it, right? But can be a natural, you don't want to build two subway systems under New York City. Like, that doesn't make sense. It will never make sense, right? To run two. The infrastructure just costs too much. To put in a new subway under New York City, right? I mean, it's impossible, right? And so that's the example that we're going to use. But the government uses this economic regulation to try and make that enterprise, that market, as socially optimal as possible. Okay, we're going to talk you through those options here in a minute. And then the second piece of that, the antitrust policy, that's really laws. It's a set of laws that have really been in the development for over 100 years in this country, trying to really refine a way to regulate companies, to regulate markets in a way that it promotes competition in markets where competition is desirable, right? And so it's just two different essentially sets of approaches, depending on whether we're talking about competitive markets or we're talking about sort of a natural monopoly market. So we're going to start with the natural monopoly one. okay? So regulating natural monopolies. We know that the government doesn't try and break up our gas company, our electric company, our water company. Instead, they regulate them. They keep the prices lower than would be profit maximizing for this firm and increase the quantity produced. All of that contributes to consumer surplus, right? Social welfare. So if a firm went unregulated, they would profit maximize, right? We know they don't get to, but they would, okay? So if a firm did get to produce at profit maximization, at that profit maximizing level of output, it would be extremely inefficient in terms of social welfare. And especially when we're talking about things like utilities and public transportation, those are necessities for a lot of people, right? A lot of people need the subway system to get to work, to get to school, to get to medical appointments, to get to the grocery store, right? That's a necessity. And utilities are really necessities too, right? Heat, air conditioning, being able to cook on your stove, and water, right? That's life-sustaining stuff. So there is an incentive for the government to want to maximize social welfare, especially in the cases of natural monopolies, okay? So a lot of utilities, right, which was my first example of natural monopolies, it's probably the most common example, public utilities are usually government owned. So a lot of times, in especially small cities, a water company, a gas company, an electric company actually isn't going to come in and set up an operation. It's just too much upfront costs. There's too much infrastructure. There's too much unknown. There's not enough business, whatever. The government actually ends up doing it. Or the government takes over an operation if a firm is like, yeah, we're not staying. We got to go. This isn't profit. I mean, we're not making any money. We're losing, whatever, right? And walk away. The government will step in and run those utilities. So public utilities many times are owned by the government straight out, but if they're not, they're going to be regulated by the government, okay? In terms of price, and price really does determine quantity, right? Ideally, a government would come in and they would set the price equal to marginal cost. That would maximize social welfare, okay? Setting price, that's where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost for a society, right? We maximize, we absolutely drain the demand. We give everybody the goods that they want at a very low price. The problem is, a firm would actually lose money if the government came in and demanded that they do something like that. And so what we're going to look at next, the graph that we're going to look at next, addresses all the different scenarios when it comes to natural monopolies, where they would profit maximize, and then a couple of options that the government has when regulating natural monopolies. Okay, I know this is all a hodgepodge right now, but the graph I'm about to show you is good stuff. This graph, this is the meat of this chapter, is this graph, okay? So if I was going to pick, one slide from this chapter that's going to be heavily weighted on the exam, it would be this one. So if I were you, I would take some notes. We're going to talk about some specific points and what they mean and options for government regulation and things like that. You're going to want to take some notes, I promise, okay? So if we are looking at all of these cost curves, demand curve, revenue curve, whatever, for a natural monopoly, in this case, we are talking about a subway system. And actually, your author does a really nice job explaining what I'm about to explain. So if you need to go back and reread this, I would, or if you need to come back and watch this little clip from one of my YouTube videos, you should, because this is going to be important. I can ask you several different questions just based on this graph alone, okay? If this firm was going to profit maximize, there was no regulation at all. This firm would profit maximize where every firm profit maximizes, and that's at the quantity where MR equals MC. Now, on this particular graph, we are looking at long run marginal cost and long run average cost. Don't get caught up in that. You can look at that LRAC, that long run average cost curve, just like you would look at your ATC, average total cost curve. It's the same thing, just we're talking about the long run instead of the short run. Sometimes they look similar in the long and short run, and sometimes they don't. Don't worry about that. Our analysis is the same, okay? So we find MR equals MC, MR, right? The blue line that lies underneath the demand curve, and then MC marginal cost, in this case, it's long run, don't get caught up in that. And that would happen at a quantity of 50. So 50 would be your profit maximizing quantity. So then this firm would go up to the demand curve to find their price. In this case, that happens at point B, which would be $4 per trip on the subway, and they would then produce 50 million trips per month. And they would make all that profit, right? Because then we would go down to the average cost curve, our ATC, which is down at that black line. And that would tell us that at a quantity of 50, the average cost would be $2.50 per unit. We'd make $1.50 on each unit, right? If we sold them for $4 a piece. That's if we could profit maximize. So if I were you, in my notes, I'd be like, graph on regulating monopoly. Point B is profit maximization, right? Sorry, I might sneeze. But this firm is never going to be allowed to do that. Never going to be allowed to do that. Instead, the government goes much farther down on this demand curve, goes much farther down in price, tries to expand quantity out to some socially optimal level, right? The government has two choices, okay? And we call it the regulatory dilemma. And the first choice they have is to allow this monopoly to produce down at point H. So point H is the second of the third points we're going to talk about. We talked about B, that's profit maximizing price and quantity. H, if you look and see, right, where our average cost curve intersects our demand curve, that's break even. So H is break even. Now, break even from an economic perspective means zero economic profit. You're still making an accounting profit, right? You're making zero economic profit, which we know from all the market structure talk we've had, that that's just a thing, right? There are a lot of firms that can only expect to earn a normal profit, and that's okay, right? So if the government came in, right, and the government, when the government goes into a natural monopoly to try and figure out, right, how to regulate, what price is fair, things like that, what they'll do is they'll ask the natural monopolist for their financials and figure out what their costs are. Because they really do want to give the natural monopolist a fair return, because they really do want them to stay in business, right? They're an important entity. And so at point H, what we would be doing, right, is allowing the monopolist to earn zero economic profit, a normal profit, sort of break even from an economic perspective, but that's still an accounting profit. And you can see that initially, if this firm got to profit maximize, we would end up with consumer surplus in the triangle at the top that's like ABC. But if we regulate them down to a price of $1.50 and increase the quantity produced to 90, which is what happens at point H, $1.50 and 90, right? Now we have this much larger triangle of consumer surplus. Starts at A, goes all the way down to H, and then cuts across horizontally to where that price of 150 is. That's a ton of consumer surplus, right? And that's what happens when we regulate natural monopolies. Because this stuff is important and its necessities, right? Getting the price down is important. So we would allow them, our natural monopolists, to get a fair return, zero economic profit, but this doesn't maximize social welfare. So the government could go even one step further from here, right? This gives us a lot more consumer surplus, than if we let them profit maximize. But we can take it one step further. Really, down there at point E, which is the third point we're going to talk about, down at point E is really where we can max out on social welfare. That's where the marginal benefit, which sits on the demand curve, right? What we're willing to pay for something directly reflects the benefit that we expect to receive from, right? So our benefit sits on the demand curve. The marginal cost, right, sits on that red line right there. Where those two meet is really where this economy maxes out on the social welfare from this activity. Well, let's look at point E. Point E is 105 trips per month, right? Any unit after that, the person actually doesn't value what it costs to produce, so shouldn't produce beyond 105 million units at 50 cents per trip, at 50 cents per trip. I mean, that's cheap, right? But it maximizes social welfare. Here's the problem. Here's the problem. Is when we find that price of 50 cents, the way we determine the average cost is we got to go up to the average cost curve. We don't use marginal cost to really help gauge profit or loss. We use our average cost to gauge profit or loss. And so in this case, we would have to travel up from our demand curve or our price of 50 cents. We would have to travel up to point G, which is on our average cost curve. That represents a loss for this company. This company would lose 75 cents per ticket if the government forced them to sell tickets at 50 cents a piece and provide 105 million trips per month. If the government makes that decision, the government has a choice. Government can choose point H or point E. Point H, allow them to get a fair return, don't maximize social welfare. Then we have point E, maximize social welfare, but the firm experiences a loss. If the government chooses point E, what do they have to be willing to do? Firm's losing money.
Wouldn't they have to be willing to take over the firm if the people running the firm decided that it wasn't economically feasible?
That is one option. Great. That is one option. The government might have to come in and say, you know, we'll take it over. We want to push social welfare to its absolute maximum. Or Maggie and Eric are correct as well. They would need to subsidize, and this happens all the time, right? The government would need to come in, and for every 50-cent ticket that's sold, the government would need to put in 75 cents because that 50-cent ticket costs the firm $1.25. And so the government has to make up the difference. Okay, like I said, it happens all the time. Now here's the irony about subsidizing versus like pulling back on social welfare, so going from point E back to point H, is that the public pays the price either way. Government gets their revenue. The government pays that 75 subsidy out of their pool of revenue. Their pool of revenue comes from us, right? Or it could be borrowed, potentially. So we either pay a higher price for our ticket, $1.50, or we pay a lower price for our ticket and it's subsidized through tax revenue. I mean, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It just depends on what the government's objective is. The government gets to make that decision, okay, whether they want to step in and subsidize or not. It seems like in the case of a subway system that is the lifeline of people in big cities who don't have transportation, in places where it's too expensive to own a car, there's no place to park a car, there's like you can hardly drive a car, right? If you think about a place like New York City, trying to actually drive that down to point E just might be in the best interest of the people, just because in their case, a subway is such a necessity, right? It gets people to all those places they need to be. But the government gets to decide. HE, they get to decide. Either way, you and I end up paying for it, right? Either with ticket prices or with our taxes that gets turned around and used as subsidies, right? But obviously point B isn't an option. $4 subway tickets isn't an option, okay? So this is me. Any questions about that graph? It's important that you understand points B, H, and E on the graph. Good, okay. So this next slide is actually a summary of what we just talked about. So subsidizing a natural monopolist is basically the act of the government paying, right? In this case, it was that 75-cent difference in order to ensure the profit for a firm. I think the government would rather subsidize than take over the firm entirely, but that is an option. If they set the price, so that top one is point, sorry, I have to go back, is point E. So this subsidizing a natural monopolist, this would happen if we chose point E. Setting price equal to average cost, this is your point H. Regulators, the government, would establish a fair return for the firm. So normal profit, zero economic profit. And this creates, like I said, what we call the regulatory dilemma, which is the choice. The government has to make a choice. They have to choose between subsidies and social welfare, right? If they subsidize, they can maximize social welfare. If they don't subsidize, they do not maximize social welfare. So it's probably going to have to do with pressure from voters, the public. What does the public want? Is there pressure to subsidize and push consumer surplus to its absolute max? All right, so we're going to switch gears a little bit, and then the rest of this chapter is sort of just hopping around from sort of topic to topic, theory to theory on economic regulation and antitrust policy. So alternative theories of economic regulation. So your author, and I think this is very important, and I think it's a very worthwhile discussion, talks about alternative theories of economic regulation. And these, I mean, when we say these are alternative theories, I think we end up with a combination of these in reality, but what he wants you to recognize, and it's an important thing to recognize, is that the government doesn't always put economic regulation in place for the general public. There is a theory that they should be, at least, right, doing things that are in the public interest, in the interest of the masses, of the public, taking everyone's interest into account when they decide what kind of economic regulation they're going to impose. That doesn't always happen. I think we all know that there's some pretty shady stuff that goes on when it comes to regulations and tax laws and, you know, all of that type stuff. I think we know that there are people that benefit more than others, and sometimes the general public is not taken into account. And so that would be this opposite theory, something called special interest. So public interest, let's do what's best for the masses. Special interest, let's do what's best for this little group of people. Why would the government put the interests of some small group of people above the interests of the general public? Thoughts? It happens. Because you and I do not, thank you, Dennis, because you and I do not make huge monetary contributions to political campaigns. We don't. We might throw a couple bucks in the pool, right, for some sort of a political candidate. Who do you think pays for these campaigns? These candidates are not taking, typically, I can't say never, typically are not taking money out of their own pockets to run for office, right? They're gathering up money from other people. No one's going to give you $1 million, $10 million of political campaign contributions without expecting something in return. Simple economics, right? And so when you think about who's funding political campaigns, you should be very, very concerned, okay? Because those are really the groups that are going to get their issues addressed before, you know, everyday people who aren't making huge political campaigns, contributions. You have to get something in return to continue to do that. And so I think this theory of regulation says that there's these small groups of people who make these huge political campaign contributions who get their needs addressed before you and me. It happens all the time, okay? It probably happens more than we think. But when we're talking about a special interest group, we're talking about something like a union. You know, we talked about unions. So like the auto workers union would be a special interest group. And they do make huge political campaign contributions, right? Because they expect when that candidate gets elected that they will get something in return. Well, what are they going to get in return? Economic regulation in their favor, okay? I told you I worked for a coal mining company, you know, through college and then when I got out of college for a few more years. And they took money out of my paycheck every month. I voluntarily, right, let them take money out of my paycheck because we paid lobbyists that went to DC and lobbied for the coal mining industry, a nasty, dirty industry that you can see now is seeing its way out because it no longer gets the same protection of economic regulation that it used to get. But there's huge industries that are paying tens of millions of dollars to get a politician or politicians to implement economic regulation in their favor, okay? So these are the two different theories. Now, I would say that we get economic regulation really that fall under both theories or a combination of theories, but I think that special interest economic regulation probably happens more often than you think it does. Just food for thought, right? So that brings us to something we call the capture theory of regulation. This is a theory. This is a theory, but it's a pretty decent one. So the capture theory of regulation says that the government doesn't go out looking to put regulations in place. The government doesn't actively like wander around looking for things to regulate. Instead, they wait for an industry to come get regulation for itself. Now, this is very counterintuitive and kind of bizarre, but it's actually holds true some of the time. And that is that, you know, industries will come looking for regulation because a lot of time the regulation actually protects them and doesn't make things more difficult for them. It's bizarre, right? Now, I actually ran into a really odd example of this a few years ago. And I was surprised by it because I haven't really run into this firsthand, this capture theory of regulation. I know it exists, right? But I have property up in the mountains in Colorado, middle of nowhere, right? So I get this email from the Colorado Department of Agriculture. The bee populations in Colorado are down. And I don't know how many of you know the bee situation, but it's kind of a problem, right? We're killing off all the bees are dying due to pesticides and things like that. And bees are pollinators, and Colorado's a big agricultural state. And so they want to get the bee populations back up. So they're offering to subsidize beehives in rural locations to try and boost the bee populations. And I was like, I'm not doing anything with that property anyway. Let's put some beehives up there, right? So I'm doing my research, trying to figure out how much this is going to cost, what's involved, yada, yada, and get to the point where I need to figure out where to order bees from and how much they're going to cost and all of that kind of stuff. It's what I do, right? I put together a cost-benefit analysis. So I called the Department of Agriculture and I said, I'm interested in this bee subsidy thing and putting these bees up at this property where I'm trying to price out bees because you order them in the mail, I know. Where do I need to order the bees from? Like, tell me who the Colorado bee supplier is. And they were like, oh, we don't care. I was like, no, 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 you don't understand what I'm asking. Like, where do you want like, what kind of bees do you want put up? Because not all bees are created equal. They're not all the same, right? And I'm thinking that the Department of Agriculture would want the bees released in Colorado to be indigenous, like the bees that are native to that area, right? Didn't care. Tell me I could bring bees in from anywhere. Like, there was no regulation, which I found appalling, right? Because I don't know that the people of Colorado understand that insects are being imported into their state and then just released willy-nilly and nobody's regulating them, right? Well, I didn't end up doing it because I was totally uncomfortable with this. I wanted them to tell me, give me a list of suppliers who supplied native Colorado bees. And they wouldn't do it. And I actually called them back and I said, you know what? I want to know why you don't care. I want to know. This doesn't make any sense to me. And they said, the beekeepers of Colorado don't want to be regulated. And I thought, who cares what the beekeepers of Colorado want, right? There's this tiny group that has somehow gotten enough political pull, go figure, right, to make sure that the bees that they are bringing in to Colorado are not regulated. Now, if I was the Department of Agriculture in Colorado, I would think that that would be my job, would be to make a decision that was best for the environment, best for the agriculture. Anyway, I know it's a bizarre example, but I was just floored, right, at this capture theory of regulation that I saw happen before my eyes. But this isn't the only place it happens, right? We're talking about bees. I mean, this happens on a much larger scale as well, okay? The US government isn't going to run around trying to make its job more difficult. That makes sense, right? And so they wait for somebody to come to them looking for some regulation, or in this case, beekeepers didn't want to be regulated. They weren't gonna spend their time regulating bees in Colorado. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears from economic regulation to antitrust policies. Antitrust laws are laws that have essentially been evolving over the last 100+ years to address situations including monopolies, anti-competitive practices, and things like that, okay? It really started, you don't need to know a lot of the dates and a lot of the specifics. I'll tell you what you need to know. But this all started with the Sherman Antitrust Act. This was the government's first attempt to try and put some sort of a law package together to address monopolies. I mentioned several weeks ago that there was there's a Netflix series called The Men Who Built America that was really about a handful of American families who at one point, monopolized everything in this country, and people got sick of it. And so this was kind of the first attempt to address monopolies in the United States. Andrew, when they sell their honey, don't they have to go, they do have to go through the FDA, but the FDA doesn't necessarily care if those bees are native to Colorado or not, right? It just has to be like food grade honey. It just has to be safe for consumption. What I was concerned about is like the transporting of insects from region to region with absolutely like no attempt to make sure that, I mean, it seems like it would be beneficial, right, to keep your insects native, to have Colorado be raised. I don't know how that all happens, but bee sellers be selling native Colorado bees. I don't know, but I don't know that the FDA would care about that. Yeah, I think they would just care that it was of food grade. Yeah, safe for consumption. But this first Sherman Antitrust Act was pretty vague and had lots of loopholes, and it seemed like companies, could still continue to do what they were doing and could find ways around it. It was really the Clayton Act of 1914 that began to close some of those like loopholes that were left by the Sherman Antitrust Act. And a couple other big things that the Clayton Act did. These are important. I'm sure these sound like good multiple choice questions. Was they prohibited time contracts and exclusive dealings, which were very anti-competitive activities. Time contracts was a situation where a firm would require a buyer of one good to also buy another. So a present day example would be you go and buy like a computer printer at Office Depot, and you then had to sign a contract that said you would buy all your ink from Office Depot as well, right? So they would sell you the printer for cheap and then begin to raise prices on those ink cartridges and, right, create a situation where you didn't have any options, right? Anti-competitive. And then exclusive dealings is sort of like next level on that. That would be like Home Depot saying, if you want office supplies from us, you have to buy all your office supplies from us. So you can't go to Staples to buy office supplies. You got to buy everything from us. And those were pretty common back in the day, right? 100+ years ago. And so one of the big things the Clayton Act did was prohibit those things. And then the FTC, Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914. So this came out at the same time as the Clayton Act. Addressed mergers. So mergers, that's when two companies, right, sort of join together to become one larger company. We'll get into some more specifics on that here in a minute. Let's talk about antitrust enforcement. Whose job is it to find violations and to enforce violations? Well, that's going to be the Federal Trade Commission or the Justice Department. Those are going to be the two US government entities that have jurisdiction, that have the power to press charges against firms for antitrust violation. Antitrust violations are very hard to prove in a lot of cases. And we talked about this. We talked about collusion and how there's a lot of informal collusion that happens. So in many cases, it's very difficult for the Federal Trade Commission or the Justice Department to look at a situation and be able to prove that there's collusion happening. Their way around that is something we call a consent decree. And a consent decree is a document. It's a legally binding decree that the FTC or the Justice Department presents to firms that they think might be doing something shady. So if they look at a firm and say, we think this activity might be in violation of antitrust policy, but we can't prove it, a lot of times what they will do is they will approach the firm and say, listen, we think we know what you're doing. We can't prove it yet, but we think we know what you're doing. And we can stop this right here if you will sign this piece of paper that says you will discontinue that activity. You don't have to tell us you're guilty of antitrust violations, but just sign this decree that says you will stop doing X, Y, Z, and then we'll back off of you unless you violate the decree. So it's kind of a way to sort of trap firms, even if you can't prove they're in violation of antitrust policy, to at least get them to stop doing what it is that you think might be in violation of antitrust activity. So it's a pretty common way for the FTC and the Justice Department to approach these sorts of issues. Okay, so depending on the court, depending on the judge, where these cases end up, these laws, these antitrust laws can be applied two different ways. They can be applied sort of straight in terms of firms are either in violation of the policies or they're not. Like there is no ifs, ands, buts. There is no conditions here. You're either in violation or you're not. Or the court can dig a little deeper and look at the circumstances of that particular firm, why they might be doing some of the things that they're doing and if there might be a legitimate reason that they're doing or participating in the activities that they are. It's like if you cut your prices, that doesn't mean you're violating antitrust policies and trying to chase another firm out of the market. Doesn't mean you are. You might be, right? And so this is just two ways for the courts to look at violations of antitrust. Per se, illegality doesn't really look at any of the conditions. It would just say, this is what you're doing. You're cutting prices to chase firms out of the market. You're guilty, whatever. I am getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So hopefully we can stay engaged here for a couple more minutes. And the rule of reason is really looking at specific circumstances and seeing if maybe we can come up with a reason why you might not be in violation, that there might be some other reason why you're participating in these activities. All right, so let's talk just really quickly about mergers. The Federal Trade Commission actually must approve all mergers. So two companies who want to join together to form a newer, bigger company can't do that without approval. And so what the Federal Trade Commission is going to do when firms submit paperwork to see if they can get their merger approved is they're going to look at market power. What does this do to market power? If these two firms are to join, are we going to end up with a situation where we have, you know, one large firm that basically dominates this market? Because if that's the case, it's probably not going to get approved, right? But it goes through a process. And one of the tools they use is something called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. And I believe this is something you have to do in your homework. I didn't put the calculation on here. Maybe I should have, but I know it's in your book and it's really easy. You just square numbers and add them. So it's no big deal. But it's a tool to measure sales concentration. So this index, what this index does is like it looks at a pre-merger market and figures out if there's any dominant firms in the market, like how the market shares are split. And then they do like a hypothetical post-merger calculation and do a comparison. It's mildly interesting. And I think when you go through and do the calculation, you'll see that it's kind of an interesting, it's just one tool that's used by the FTC to sort of get a grasp on whether this merger would be appropriate or would erode the competitive nature of a market. Mergers typically come in waves. We find historically that because of economic conditions or whatever, we find that we have periods where there are lots of mergers and then we have periods where there aren't, right? Okay, so let's just look at pure monopoly and effective competition, which is the first and the last set of bars here. I think that's going to be the most telling for us. But you can see that over time, the measurement is from the 30s to 2000. You can see that the percentage of firms in our market that are pure monopolies has decreased over time, clearly, right? And effective competition has been on the rise if you look at that last set of bars. So basically, this is just to say that antitrust policy has been fairly effective over the past, right, 80 years or whatever. Some of the problems with antitrust. So like anything else, there's going to be ups and there's going to be downs. Some of the problems with antitrust is going to be that because US firms participate in a global market, how are we to say how many firms in the US portion of the market are required for competition? Because we're not just in competition with other US firms, we're in competition with the world. So there might just be one firm in a market here in the US, but they're in competition with firms around the world. So that's one of the things that's a little tricky about antitrust law, is the global market has really changed things. We do see antitrust abuses. There are firms that just want to create problems for their competing firms, and so they charge them with antitrust violations, which goes into federal court. And we spend a lot of money trying to address, as public, trying to address some of these accusations in court, and ties up our court system. That's a problem, right? Growth of international markets, that's sort of what I talked about with that first one. Competition may not require that many firms because of international global markets. And then this last one, bailing out troubled markets. The government sometimes, right, and there's good and there's bad to this too, will bail out certain companies because the government feels like they want to keep them in business, or that it's in the best interest of the American people to keep these firms in business. So this could be banking, this could be manufacturing. When the government decides to bail out troubled industries, what they're doing is they're not letting competition take its course. When competition takes its course, there are going to be firms that are inefficient or have lost comparative advantage that need to go. And when the government bails out those companies, what they're doing is basically not allowing the natural course of competition to take place. And so that creates problems too. That's all I have. Sorry, we went a minute over. Any questions?